I live alone. Most days, I do not speak to another human being until the evening, if at all. And I want to tell you something that may surprise you. I am more content, more peaceful, and more genuinely happy than I was during many of the busiest, most socially crowded years of my life. My dear friends, after 65, I discovered that solitude, when approached correctly, is not a punishment to endure. It is a gift to be mastered. I know this may sound difficult to believe, especially in a world that constantly tells us we need a wide circle of friends, a full calendar, and constant social connection in order to be truly happy in our later years. I want to be honest with you today about something our culture rarely admits. For many of us, particularly as we age, an active social life filled with obligation, drama, and shallow connection is not actually the source of happiness we have been promised. Sometimes, it is the very thing standing between us and the peace we are searching for. I am not here to tell you that friendship has no value, or that human connection does not matter. It does, deeply. But I am here to tell you something I learned only after many years of struggling with loneliness, then struggling with forced socializing, and finally, after much trial and difficulty, discovering genuine contentment in solitude itself. I want to walk you through exactly how I arrived here, and I want to give you the practical wisdom that allowed this transformation to become permanent rather than temporary. Let us begin. The years I feared being alone, I want to be honest about where I started, because I believe many of you will recognize this in yourselves. For most of my adult life, I was terrified of being alone. This fear did not announce itself loudly. It lived quietly underneath many of my decisions. I filled my calendar with social obligations I did not particularly enjoy, simply because the alternative, an empty evening with no plans, felt unbearable to me. I maintained friendships that had long since become draining rather than nourishing, because I believed that having friends, regardless of the quality of those friendships, was better than having none at all. When my wife passed away 11 years ago, this fear intensified dramatically. Suddenly, the home that had always been filled with her presence became profoundly quiet, and that silence terrified me. I threw myself into constant socializing in the years that followed. I accepted every invitation. I filled every available evening. I told myself I was simply staying active, staying engaged, staying connected. But if I am honest with you, much of this activity was not born from genuine enjoyment. It was born from a desperate need to avoid sitting alone with myself, because I believed, somewhere deep inside, that being alone meant being unwanted, unloved, forgotten. This pattern continued for several years, and I want to tell you honestly, it did not produce happiness. It produced exhaustion. I found myself constantly tired, constantly managing other people's expectations, constantly navigating small conflicts and disappointments that seem to accompany any large social circle, particularly among people our age, many of whom carry their own unresolved grief, their own anxieties, their own complicated histories that inevitably surface within group dynamics. I remember one evening in particular, sitting at a dinner gathering with several acquaintances, surrounded by conversation and laughter, and feeling profoundly, achingly lonely despite being in a room full of people. This moment, more than any other, became the beginning of a transformation I could not have predicted. The realization that changed everything. Sitting at that dinner, surrounded by people yet feeling completely alone inside myself, I finally understood something important. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing, and I had been confusing them for years. Loneliness is a painful sense of disconnection, often felt most acutely in the presence of others when genuine connection is absent. Solitude, on the other hand, is simply the state of being physically alone, and it carries no inherent emotional quality at all. It can be peaceful, or it can be uncomfortable, entirely depending on how you have learned to inhabit it. I realized, sitting in that crowded room, that I had spent years desperately avoiding solitude because I mistakenly believed it was the same thing as loneliness. But in truth, I had experienced profound loneliness even while surrounded by people, and I began to wonder whether solitude itself, approached differently, might actually offer something that crowded social obligation never could, genuine peace, rather than merely the appearance of connection. This realization did not transform my life overnight. It took years of deliberate practice, genuine trial and error, and a willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to discover what existed on the other side of it. But I want to share with you now the specific practices that allowed me to move from fearing solitude to genuinely mastering it, because I believe these same practices can help many of you who may be struggling with similar fears. The first practice, I learned to distinguish between chosen solitude and imposed isolation. The first shift I had to make was understanding that solitude I actively chose felt entirely different from isolation that simply happened to me. For years, I had experienced my alone time as something imposed upon me by circumstance, by the passing of my wife, by friends who had moved away or passed away themselves, by children who had built lives in distant cities. This framing made every quiet evening feel like evidence of loss, of being left behind, of a life diminished by circumstances outside my control. I began, deliberately, to reframe this. Rather than viewing my solitude as something that had happened to me, I began asking myself, each day, how I wished to actively use this time that was available to me. This shift from passive isolation to active, chosen solitude changed everything about how the same quiet hours actually felt. The hours themselves did not change. My relationship to those hours changed completely. I want to be honest that this reframing required genuine practice. Old thought patterns do not disappear simply because you decide, once, to think differently. Each morning, for a period of many months, I would deliberately remind myself, today's solitude is not something happening to me. It is something I am choosing to inhabit fully, on purpose, because I have discovered genuine value within it. Over time, this deliberate reframing became natural rather than forced, and the emotional quality of my alone time shifted correspondingly. The second practice, I built a structure for my days that did not depend on other people. One of the most important discoveries I made was that contentment in solitude requires genuine structure, not simply empty, unplanned time. For years, my sense of purpose each day had been organized around social obligations: lunch with a friend, a phone call with a family member, an errand run alongside a neighbor. When these external anchors disappeared or became less frequent, my days felt shapeless and empty, not because solitude itself was the problem, but because I had never built a structure that could sustain meaning independent of other people's presence. I began, deliberately, to construct a daily rhythm that gave my alone time genuine purpose and structure. My mornings begin with quiet reading, something I genuinely enjoy, followed by a walk regardless of weather, which grounds me physically and mentally before the day fully begins. My afternoons are often devoted to a project, sometimes woodworking, which I took up seriously only after my wife passed, sometimes writing letters to my grandchildren, sometimes simply tending carefully to my garden. My evenings involve a specific ritual of preparing a proper meal for myself, not simply eating out of convenience, but treating the preparation and enjoyment of my own dinner as something worthy of genuine care and attention. This structure, my friends, is what transformed empty time into full time. Solitude without structure often becomes a breeding ground for rumination, anxiety, and a creeping sense of purposelessness. Solitude with genuine structure becomes something entirely different, a container within which real satisfaction, real accomplishment, and real peace can actually grow. The third practice, I released the need for external validation of my days. For much of my life, I measured whether a day had been good or worthwhile based on how it appeared to others. Did I have interesting stories to share at the next social gathering? Did my day sound impressive or eventful when described to my children during our weekly calls? This external measurement, I eventually realized, was quietly undermining my ability to experience genuine contentment in solitude, because solitary days, however peaceful and fulfilling internally, often do not produce dramatic stories worth sharing. I made a deliberate decision to stop measuring my days by how they would sound to others, and instead began measuring them by how they actually felt to me while I was living them. A quiet morning spent reading by my window, though it would produce no interesting story for anyone else, began to register in my own internal accounting as a genuinely good use of my time, simply because it brought me peace and satisfaction while I was experiencing it. This shift, releasing external validation as my measurement of a worthwhile day, freed me enormously. I no longer needed my solitude to be impressive or eventful to anyone but myself. I simply needed it to be genuinely peaceful and meaningful within my own direct experience, and this standard, unlike external validation, was entirely within my own control to meet, day after day. The fourth practice, I learned to enjoy my own company by becoming genuinely interesting to myself. This practice may sound unusual, but I believe it was perhaps the most transformative of all. I began treating my own mind and my own interests with the same curiosity and investment I once reserved for cultivating friendships with others. I began learning subjects I had always been curious about but never had time to pursue: the history of astronomy, the basics of a new language, the craft of proper bread baking. I approached these pursuits not as ways to fill empty time, but as genuine investments in becoming a more interesting, more engaged, more alive version of myself. What I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, was that as I invested in my own growth and curiosity, my own company became genuinely enjoyable rather than something to be endured or distracted from. I began looking forward to my quiet evenings the way I once looked forward to visits from close friends, because those evenings had become filled with genuine engagement, learning, and satisfaction that came entirely from within myself, requiring no external source to sustain it. I want to encourage you, my friends, to consider what pursuits you may have set aside during the busier years of your life, when family obligations, career demands, and social commitments consumed most of your available time. Your later years, particularly years spent significantly alone, offer a rare and valuable opportunity to finally return to these pursuits, not as compensation for lost social connection, but as genuine investments in your own depth, curiosity, and internal richness. The fifth practice, I stopped comparing my life to a social standard that no longer served me for years, even after I began finding genuine peace in solitude. A nagging voice remained within me, comparing my quiet, solitary life to a social standard I had absorbed from the world around me, a standard suggesting that a full calendar, a wide circle of friends, and constant social engagement represented the only legitimate path to a good life in one's later years. I had to consciously and repeatedly release this comparison. I reminded myself, often, that different seasons of life call for different rhythms, and that a rich, socially crowded life is simply one legitimate way to live, not the only legitimate way. My own path, quieter, more solitary, more internally focused, was not a lesser version of a good life. It was simply a different expression of one, equally valid, equally worthy of respect, including my own self-respect. This release of comparison mattered enormously, because as long as I continued measuring my solitary life against a social standard that no longer fit my genuine circumstances or preferences, I would always experience some quiet sense of inadequacy, regardless of how much actual peace I had cultivated within my daily life. Once I released this comparison entirely, my contentment deepened significantly, because it was no longer competing against an external standard that had never actually been designed for my particular life. What about genuine human connection? I want to address something honestly, my friends, because I do not want to leave you with the impression that human connection holds no value in a contented solitary life. This is not what I am suggesting. I still speak with my children regularly. I still maintain a small handful of genuine, nourishing friendships, though far fewer than the wide social circle I once believed I needed. I still attend occasional community events that genuinely interest me, not out of obligation, but out of authentic curiosity. What I have released is not human connection itself, but rather the desperate, anxious need for constant social activity as a substitute for genuine internal peace. I have discovered that a small number of deep, authentic connections, combined with a rich and satisfying relationship with my own solitude, provides far greater contentment than the wide, shallow social calendar I once maintained out of fear rather than genuine desire. I encourage you, if you are considering this path yourself, to think carefully about which relationships in your life bring genuine nourishment and which relationships you maintain primarily out of habit, obligation, or fear of being alone. Releasing the latter, while carefully preserving and deepening the former, often produces a far richer experience of connection than maintaining a large but shallow social circle purely for the sake of appearing well-connected. Addressing the fear of regret, I know some of you listening may be wondering whether choosing a quieter, more solitary life will eventually lead to regret, particularly as health challenges or genuine emergencies arise in the years ahead, when having a wide circle of people to call upon might feel more urgently necessary. I want to address this honestly, because it is a legitimate and important concern. I want to be clear that mastering contentment in solitude does not mean abandoning practical wisdom about genuine support during emergencies. I maintain clear, reliable arrangements with my children and with a small number of trusted neighbors regarding checking in and providing help should a genuine need arise. Solitude, practiced wisely, does not mean isolation from all practical support. It means releasing the anxious, constant social activity that was never actually providing genuine emotional nourishment in the first place, while maintaining clear, intentional arrangements for genuine need when it does arise. I would also gently add that regret, in my experience, tends to arise far more often from years spent living according to fear and external expectation than from years spent living according to genuine internal peace and authentic preference. When I imagine my final years, I do not imagine regretting the wide social calendar I released. I imagine, instead, that I would have regretted continuing to force myself into constant social obligation that never actually served my genuine happiness, simply because I feared what a quieter life might mean about my worth or my likability. The deeper truth about no drama, I want to speak specifically about the freedom from drama that solitude, approached wisely, genuinely provides. For many years, particularly within larger social circles, I found myself unwillingly entangled in conflicts that were never truly mine. Disagreements between mutual friends, gossip that demanded careful navigation, obligations to attend gatherings despite genuine exhaustion, simply to avoid disappointing someone or appearing unavailable. This constant management of other people's expectations, emotions, and conflicts, I eventually realized, was consuming an enormous amount of my emotional energy that, once redirected toward my own peace and genuine interests, produced far greater satisfaction than the social drama had ever provided. A contented solitary life, my friends, is remarkably free from this particular exhaustion. There are no group dynamics to manage, no competing loyalties to navigate, no obligatory gatherings attended out of guilt rather than genuine desire. This absence of drama, once I fully embraced it, became one of the most peaceful aspects of my later years. What this life has given me since fully embracing this quieter, more solitary path, my friends, I want to share honestly what my life has become. My days are structured around genuine curiosity and satisfaction rather than social obligation. My evenings are peaceful rather than exhausted. My mind, freed from the constant management of other people's expectations and conflicts, has become sharper, calmer, and more genuinely at ease than it has been in decades. I do not experience the loneliness I once feared so deeply. I have discovered that genuine solitude, properly cultivated, does not feel like loneliness at all. It feels like a deep, quiet companionship with myself, a companionship I spent most of my life avoiding, without ever understanding what genuine peace it actually contained. I want to be honest that this path is not for everyone, and I do not believe every person needs to pursue extensive solitude in order to find happiness in their later years. Some of you may genuinely thrive within a wide social circle, and if that describes you authentically, I encourage you to continue cultivating those connections with full enthusiasm. But for those of you who have quietly wondered whether a quieter, more solitary life might actually suit you better, whether the constant social activity you have maintained out of fear rather than genuine desire might be released without producing the loneliness you have always assumed would follow, I want you to know that genuine contentment in solitude is entirely possible, and it can be deliberately cultivated through consistent, intentional practice. My final words to you, my dear friends, if you are past 65 and finding yourself with more solitary hours than you once had, whether through the passing of a spouse, the relocation of children, or simply the natural narrowing of social circles that often accompanies these later years, I want you to know that this narrowing does not have to represent loss. It can represent, instead, a genuine opportunity to discover a form of contentment that constant social activity, however well-intentioned, may have been quietly preventing you from ever fully experiencing. You do not need a wide circle of friends to live a genuinely rich, meaningful life. You do not need a full calendar to prove your worth or your likability. You need, instead, a genuine, actively cultivated relationship with your own company, built through structure, curiosity, self-respect, and the release of external comparison. This relationship, once genuinely established, will provide a form of peace that no amount of social activity, however pleasant, can fully replicate. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If these words resonated with you, I hope you will begin, even in small ways, cultivating a genuine, intentional relationship with your own solitude, not as a consolation for what you may have lost, but as a genuine gift available to you in these later years, waiting patiently to be discovered. This has been Life Mastery 60+. Until next time, embrace your own good company, protect your peace, and remember that a quiet life, lived fully and intentionally, is never a lesser life at all.